Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
My mother raised her glass like a judge preparing to deliver a life sentence dressed as a toast, and with that soft smile she saves for moments when she wants to look generous while tightening a noose. She announced that my brother deserved the family house more than I did because he had a family to support. And for a heartbeat, all I heard was the dull electrical hum of the dining room light and the tiny clink of Kara's bracelet against her fork while Evan angled his phone to show her some triumphant Zillograph. I took a long sip so my hand would not tremble, set the glass down with Kara surgeon would respect, and said, gently but precisely, that her statement was strange since the keys were already in my pocket. At which point the room froze so completely that even the cranberry sauce looked like it was holding its breath. Silence, in our family, has never been empty. It fills with calculation, with the rustle of old stories being pulled from the attic and dusted off, with my mother's habit of counting favors the way a shopkeeper counts coins, and with Evan's theatrical sigh that announces we have all been unreasonable yet again. So I let the stillness settle until it became a surface I could step onto without sinking, and only then did I place the keys on the runner where the brass caught the light like a small confession. My mother's smile dropped half a centimeter. Kara arranged her face into politeness bright enough to burn, and Evan tilted his head in that way he used to when he was about to borrow something indefinitely. My bicycle, my sweater, my air. He went first, as always, explaining that I never even liked the house, that I was the one who left for grad school as if leaving to learn counted as an abandonment ceremony, that the house should stay with the person who had responsibilities. While Kara nodded like a church usher and my mother folded her napkin into a triangle sharp enough to cut, I inhaled through the nose the way my therapist, who charges like a boutique hotel but earns it, taught me, and I reminded Evan that the word executor printed next to my name was not a decorative flourish, but a job description, which does not claim ownership. True, yet it does require competence, something Dad valued even when it annoyed everyone. My mother reached toward the kitchen with a casual glance that was anything but casual, and when she returned she slid a manila envelope across the table with the benevolent flourish of a talk show host gifting a blender, announcing that since I loved paperwork I could read an agreement Evan had drafted, a family understanding, she called it, where I would transfer the house within a reasonable period because I was single and unburdened. And while my brother tried to look humble and failed, I read the heading and the phrasing and the little trapdoor words like reasonable and good faith, then placed the pages beside the keys as if they were coasters and said, as nicely as a person can when rearranging a loaded weapon. That reasonable is a lawyer word which generally means please fight me in slow motion. What I did next was not screaming or flinging mashed potatoes or staging an argument for the neighbors. I opened the router app under the table, where it lived next to my calendar and my grocery list. And I changed the Wi-Fi password from the old family dog's name to a new phrase only I would remember, something Dad used to say when the water heater rattled, then watched, with a serenity I admit was slightly petty, as Evan's phone lost connection and the proud Zillow page became a dinosaur in a desert, and Kara's tablet showed the same extinction event, and my mother, who never trusted the internet until it supported one of her arguments, asked whether the service was down. To which I replied that the service was working beautifully but was no longer in the habit of subsidizing hostile presentations at holiday dinners. Evan called it childish, which coming from a man who once staged a family vote about who ate the last slice of pie felt like performance art, and I told him that sliding a typed demand across a table and calling it a family agreement belonged in the same nursery. Then I took from my bag a folded, notarized letter with my father's seal, and without breaking the seal I set it next to the keys, so they could all see the envelope breathe quietly between us. I said there would be no kitchen table trial, that Mr. Alvarez would read the trust tomorrow morning, that everyone was invited to attend and argue with an adult present who charges by the hour and therefore limits poetry. Kara played the card I had expected, 2 kids, a yard, a chance to make memories that did not involve a rental. And I felt that pitch land as it always does because I am not made of stone and I remember summers of wiffle ball and sprinkler spray as clearly as I remember the sound of Dad's drill fixing the gate. But I also remember the unglamorous part, the tax bills. The winter pipes, the roof that does not ask whether children are adorable before it leaks, and so I said what would make half the audience hate me, that wanting something does not make it yours, and that morality delivered in a choir robe is still lobbying when you strip the robe away. And my mother said my name in the tone that suggests she is disappointed I did not become a saint who also cooks. I laid out facts the way Dad taught me to lay out tools, neat and within reach. The locks would be changed at dawn. Unauthorized occupancy would void the insurance and turn any heroic secret move-in into an expensive mistake. The trust would be honored exactly as written, and until we had read every line with someone whose diploma actually matters, no one would treat the house like a prize on a game show. Evan called me dramatic, which is always funny coming from him. And my mother claimed I was punishing family because I had the legal upper hand, while I simply folded the typed agreement back toward her and said, sweetly, that if she wished to use the word reasonable, we could begin with breakfast tomorrow at 9 sharp with our attorney. Where reasonable has teeth. When the pie arrived, store-bought despite 3 days of speeches about tradition, I set a small place card under Dad's empty chair, a rectangle I had lettered last night in a moment of weakness and stubbornness, and I slid it just far enough for everyone to read. Reserved for the person who keeps their promises, and no one reached for that chair, not even my mother who rarely resists a symbol she can weaponize. Kara's hand hovered over my keys as if testing whether I would flinch, and I let her feel the temptation before lifting them and letting them ring once against each other like a bell that ends a round, then slipping them back into my pocket where they belonged. On my way out, I paused by the thermostat, that little beige judge of comfort and cost, and I set it to an efficient number because Dad despised waste. Then I picked up my coat and told everyone, in a tone even I admired, that I would see them in the morning at Mr. Alvarez's office and that coffee would be strong. And as I stepped onto the porch, I heard Evan whisper to my mother that he could still move a few boxes tonight if he had to, which is when I sent myself a reminder to forward the insurer's written confirmation to the family group thread, and I smiled the smallest possible smile because some revenges are not fireworks but fuses, and the quiet ones warm you longer. Morning came with the kind of pale, merciless light that makes old would show every hairline crack and makes memories behave like dust motes that refuse to settle, and I parked in front of the house with the new lock set on the passenger seat, the invoice from the hardware store tucked beneath it, and my father's voice, recorded months ago in a voicemail I have saved and refused to delete, nudging me to keep my head when everyone else is busy losing theirs, so I carried the drill and the neatly labeled bags of screws up the walk, breathed in the cold that smelled faintly of wet leaves and the metal tang of the mailbox, and replaced the deadbolt with the unhurried competence of someone who learned early that patience beats volume when the stakes are not rhetorical, but made of brass and wood. The first turn of the new key felt ceremonial and, to my annoyance, a little sentimental, because grief has a trickster's instinct for timing and will step out of a closet the exact second you want to look functional and crisp. Yet I let the feeling run through me, and then I did what my father liked most, which was to write things down and take pictures of what I could not write. So I moved through the rooms with my phone camera and a clipboard, noting the hairline crack in the dining room window that looks like a faint river on an old map, the water stain behind the washing machine that suggests a whisper of a leak, the furnace filter date that no one but me ever remembers to change on time. And I filed the photos into a shared folder labeled with the dry clarity he always admired, which is to say no jokes, no epithets, only dates and parts and the sentence that matters. This is what it looked like before Mr. Alvarez arrived with coffee that smelled like he believed in me more than was professionally necessary, and when we sat at the table, he did not waste words performing empathy. He simply opened his folder and said that my father had been simple and specific, that the living trust named me as trustee, that the line I needed to read twice was the one that said the house must remain a house, and that there was a letter sealed by my father with instructions to read it entirely and alone before making any decision, after which he waited, hands folded, for the hurricane in a sweater vest that is my family to appear, and right on cue the bell rang, and there stood Evan in flannel and earnestness. My mother behind him with a tray of bakery muffins like a prop that certifies wholesomeness, and Kara guiding the kids forward because pathos, when you're running low on facts, has a way of feeling like a coupon you can keep cashing. The reading was quick in the way a well-built bridge is quick, not because it is careless, but because it knows exactly where the load will land and how to carry it. And when Mr. Alvarez finished the paragraph that used my name in the unglamorous context of fiduciary duty, Evan leaned forward with the hungry politeness of a man pitching an investor, explaining that while papers are papers, everyone at this table knows what Dad meant, that the house should remain in the family for the family that is actually a family with children and daycare and a father who, unlike his charmingly independent sister, has real obligations. And my mother nodded so hard I feared for her cervical vertebrae, while Kara added that an empty house is sad and that children deserve a yard, which is true, and also a lever that people yank when they want you to donate your spine. I told them that wanting something does not shift title, that decency would be cheaper for everyone if it didn't get used as a cudgel, and that I would obey the trust with the same irritating thoroughness I bring to changing furnace filters, which prompted a synchronized eye roll and a small speech about me loving control more than people, and perhaps that is partly true, though I think what I actually love is order in a family that treats order like a party trick, so I placed a printed copy of the insurer's notice on the table, explained that unauthorized occupants would void coverage and convert every dripping pipe into an uninsurable personal catastrophe, and texted the group thread a photo of the signed confirmation with Mr. Alvarez's business card stacked on top of it like a paperweight. Then watched Evan's face pass through the 5 predictable stages of being prevented from doing something impulsive and noble-sounding that would have cost me money. My mother tried a different route. A murmured history of childhood debts I allegedly owed, of rides to practice and casseroles after breakups, of the time I forgot to send a thank you note to Aunt Lorraine and the family embarrassment that caused. At which point Mr. Alvarez, bless the man, cleared his throat and said that the trust is a vehicle that carries instructions and does not respond to guilt as an acceptable fuel, and I said nothing because the attorney had done what I would have done. But in a tone you can invoice. Then I slid the sealed letter, heavy in away paper should not be, back into my bag, because I had no intention of reading it in front of people who weaponize sentiment while insisting they are only recalling facts. Evan suggested a family vote as if democracy is how property law works when the appetizers are good, and I said that any voting could happen in the court of group texts after he read the second page of the policy exclusion clause very slowly. And when he made a noise about moving a few boxes tonight just to get a head start, I told him that the new locks turn smoothly, that the security camera above the porch records in color and uploads to the cloud with timestamps, and that the insurer's file now includes the phrase "no authorized occupants until trustee authorization" in writing, which is a line dull enough to make even his stubbornness blink, and for a long moment no one said anything because the game had lost its oxygen. I stood, thanked Mr. Alvarez for the coffee and the spine, told my mother that I would not be staying for muffins because sugar is cheaper than accountability but has the same crash, and on the porch I paused to send the group one last message. A tidy packet containing the insurer's letter, the photographs of the locks with today's newspaper date peeking into frame like a witness, and the calendar screenshot for an appraisal appointment set for early next week, with a note that attendance is welcome, and that repairs Evan promised years ago would finally meet a stranger with a clipboard. Within a minute my phone pulsed with my mother's "Why are you doing this to your family?" and Evan's "You're going to regret humiliating us like this," and Kara's unreadable ellipsis. And I let the notification stack while I walked to my car where the sealed letter rested in my bag like a live coal, and I promised myself I would read every line tonight when the house was quiet and the Wi-Fi answered only to me, because my father asked me to understand before I acted, and because some revenges are not storms, but locks that turn with a soft, decisive click that everyone in the neighborhood hears even if they pretend they did not. By the time Sunday afternoon stretched into that gray hour when the neighbors carry recycling to the curb and the air smells like damp cardboard and leftover ambition, Evan had already texted me a draft itinerary for what he called a family summit. which sounded suspiciously like the staged vote he loves to orchestrate when he wants the outcome to look democratic while the math hides under the table. So I responded with a single line that Mr. Alvarez would have admired for its economy, confirming the appraisal appointment for midweek, attaching a politely worded right of entry notice, and reminding everyone that no one, not hopeful tenants, not well-meaning relatives, not a man with a heroic plan B, could move a single box until the trust obligations were honored and the insurer's terms were secure, after which I spent an unromantic hour with spreadsheets that tracked every repair Evan swore he would handle in the last 5 years and never did. Because if you want to keep your sanity in a family that treats memory like a etch-a-sketch, you have to love receipts. The inspector I hired was the kind of unhurried professional my father would have complimented in 2 words and a nod. A woman named Denise who wore a canvas jacket with deep pockets and a face that did not try to sell reassurance. And as she moved through the house with her clipboard and moisture meter, she called out numbers in a calm voice that made bad news feel like weather you could dress for, pointing out the slow leak under the upstairs sink that had probably been blooming longer than any of us cared to admit, the scorch-mottled wiring near the furnace that looked like a dare, the gutters mashed flat on the north side where Evan promised a fix 2 summers ago, and the roof patch along the ridgeline that had aged into the visual equivalent of a shrug. I recorded her comments, asked too many questions, and, standing in the doorway of my old bedroom where the faint outline of a poster had bleached itself into the wall like a ghost who respects painter's tape, I understood with a steadiness that surprised me that love for a house is not measured in speeches about legacy, but in whether you remember to cut back the maple branches before they scrape the shingles into confetti. When the inevitable family summit convened in Mom's living room, with a plate of cookies no one wanted to eat, but everyone touched as if touching replaced accountability, Evan opened with a sermon about sacrifice and multi-generational stability, the kind of performance that would have killed on a PTA stage, and he proposed what he called an interim arrangement where his family could occupy the house while I figure out what I actually want, which meant, translated into English, occupy now and force decisions by inertia later, and when I said no, that the trust required order before occupancy, he pivoted to a compromise so flimsy it squeaked, suggesting that the family vote on intent as a way to guide the attorneys, and Mom, who loves votes the way some people love scented candles, brightened visibly and declared that it would be healing to hear where everyone stood. I let them talk, because nothing discredits a plan like the sound it makes when it breathes, and only when the temperature of the room reached that particular lukewarm righteousness my mother confuses with wisdom did I open the folder I had brought, laying out Denise's preliminary report with its tidy page numbers and its unafraid photographs, after which I placed alongside it the cost breakdown I had compiled from 3 contractor estimates, all of which spoke fluently in the language of money, and the sleeves rolled labor that money buys, and I explained, in the most conversational tone I could manage, that the house needed immediate attention regardless of who warmed its walls at night, that liability is not a ghost you can vote away, and that the trust did not ask me to be popular, it asked me to be confident, which is a form of love my family does not recognize until after the fire truck leaves. Kara surprised me by reading every line rather than performing offense, and when she asked, almost gently, whether these numbers could be staggered across seasons so the kids could move in sooner, I felt that split in my chest that shows up whenever decency stands on one side and arithmetic on the other, and I told her something true that would make strangers dislike me, that if anyone moved in now with the wiring as it was, they would be placing their children in a position where a cheap victory today could purchase an expensive regret tomorrow, which is when Evan accused me of fearmongering. Mom whispered that I was turning into my father in the least flattering way, and I replied that Dad's unflattering way kept roofs over our heads and kept us out of courtrooms filled with fluorescent lights and unflattering truths. I slid across the coffee table a single sheet that changed the air more than any speech could have, a notice drafted with Mr. Alvarez that proposed something both simple and infuriating to people who prefer symbolism over structure, namely that if Evan wished to remain a candidate for future tenancy under the trust's terms he would, by the Friday following the appraisal, Wire a good faith repair deposit into the trust account equal to the lowest contractor's estimate for the most urgent items. Wiring, gutters, and the upstairs leak, with the clear understanding that the funds would be used for the house whether or not he ultimately lived there. And that failure to meet the deadline would not be interpreted as a moral failure, but as an adult decision to step back, while I pursued the alternative path of a short-term lease to reliable professionals who have references that can be verified without desert. The silence that followed had weight to it, and even my mother, who can normally convert any pause into a parable about filial duty, looked at the numbers and understood on some cellular level that narrative had met structure and structure was unamused. And while Evan's face moved through denial toward a tantrum he had outgrown on paper but not in practice, I sent from my phone a tidy calendar invitation titled Appraisal and Deposit Window with Mr. Alvarez CC'd, because paper trails are the only trails that matter in families like ours. Then I stood, thanked everyone for their time as if we were colleagues rather than co-actors in a holiday melodrama, and headed for the door, pausing only long enough to stick a laminated right of entry schedule to the inside of the storm door at the house with painter's tape so gentle it would not take the finish, a small act of stewardship that doubles as a shield. After which I forwarded Denise's report to the insurer and, for good measure, filed a change of address for trust correspondence to a secure P.O. box so that the next time Evan tried to intercept a piece of mail, and call it fate, he would find an empty slot where inevitability used to be. The week that followed the inspection was a slow grind of calls, emails, and small administrative victories that felt like pebbles dropped into a canyon, audible to me but ignored by the people who preferred echoing declarations over measurable results. And it was in that space between the practical and the performative that my mother decided to escalate her campaign, wrapping her disappointment in the language of morality and summoning allies who could amplify the chorus of guilt until it filled the air thick enough to choke on. She called me late at night with that carefully softened voice she uses when she wants to frame manipulation as maternal concern, telling me that the family was worried I was losing myself in paperwork, that Evan was breaking under the pressure of being sidelined, and that the children had asked why their aunt was keeping them away from their grandfather's house, as if I had changed the locks out of malice rather than necessity, and while I listened I stared at the ceiling fan in my apartment turning in lazy circles, reminding myself that one of the first things my father taught me was that people will almost always mistake silence for weakness until the day silence finally answers back. When subtle guilt failed to sway me, she escalated to spectacle, inviting Pastor Jim from her church to Sunday dinner and arranging for me to be seated directly across from him as he delivered what sounded less like a sermon and more like a rehearsed plea about legacy, family stewardship, and the moral bankruptcy of clinging to property when children's futures were at stake. My mother's eyes glistened with pride as though she had engineered divine endorsement. Evan leaned back smugly as if scripture had just notarized his claim, and Kara offered a small approving smile that suggested she considered the matter settled. I held my fork in both hands not to steady my meal but to steady myself, and when the pastor paused as though waiting for my confession, I told him calmly that morality without math is theater, that the trust was not an instrument of sentiment but of law, and that if he had concerns about stewardship, he was welcome to review the inspection report and contractor estimates currently sitting in my bag. My mother gasped as though I had blasphemed in front of royalty, and Evan barked a laugh that was half triumph and half disbelief that I could keep puncturing their choreography with unadorned facts. But the most potent escalation came not from religion or theater but from the vault of memory my mother cracked open like it was her last weapon, sitting me down in her living room surrounded by old photographs and telling me, in her most measured voice, that I owed this family more than any piece of paper could cancel. She recounted the hours she spent driving me to practices, the times Evan covered for me when I bent curfews, the casseroles delivered to my apartment after heartbreaks, the supposed debts I had accrued simply by being raised. Debts she insisted could only be paid in obedience to this new family narrative. I listened, because you cannot walk out on memory the way you walk out on an argument, but when she finished I asked her one quiet question: if debt cancels independence, then what did my father mean when he looked me in the eye before surgery and told me to carry the thing without dropping it? She blinked, as if startled to realize that Dad's words had been spoken. Not only to her chosen son, but also to the daughter she never saw as a custodian. It was then that I decided to pull the fragment from my bag, not the sealed letter, but the small voice memo my father had left on my phone, his voice rough but steady, saying, "The house should remain a house, not a battlefield or a bargaining chip," and I pressed play, letting his words roll into the room with all the authority of someone whose absence was still larger than all of us combined. For a few seconds no one breathed, not even Evan, and when the recording ended I said that the memo was not the whole of it, that there was a letter still sealed which I had not yet read, and that until his full words were in front of me I would make no compromises and accept no votes staged for optics. Evan sneered that I was dragging this out to enjoy control, Kara murmured that I was cruel to dangle answers without sharing them, and my mother folded her arms in the way that always meant she was building a wall inside herself. But I knew in that moment that their confidence had cracked, because Dad's voice, simple, plain, undeniable, had reminded them all that there was more to come, more to be revealed, and that I was the only one standing between them and the final truth. The next morning, as they stewed in the silence that follows an argument that refuses to collapse neatly into victory, I sent an email not to them, but to a leasing agent recommended by Denise the inspector, inquiring about short-term rental interest from local professionals who could both occupy and maintain the property under a transparent agreement. When the replies came back within hours, 3 nurses, a young teacher, and a city worker, I forwarded the inquiries to Mr. Alvarez with the subject line, "Exploring trust options," knowing full well that if Evan missed his deposit deadline, the house would not stand empty, and that the trust would remain intact under my care. By evening I dropped the bomb they never expected. At our next gathering I announced that the house was already scheduled for an open showing, not to prospective buyers as they had feared, but to vetted local tenants whose paperwork and references I had already reviewed, and I watched as Evan's composure fractured, as Kara's lips parted in disbelief, and as my mother's carefully rehearsed mask fell into open shock. My father's condition that the house must remain a house was not poetic, it was precise, and by preparing to lease it I had ensured it would remain what it was meant to be, occupied, maintained, respected, and alive. The silence that fell over the room was the heavy, stunned kind, not the strategic kind they usually employed, and I knew that in that moment they finally realized that control had shifted in a way they could not reverse with guilt, performance, or votes. And while I stood and collected my bag, tucking the still unopened letter deeper into its pocket, I promised myself that when I finally broke the seal it would be on my own terms, in solitude, without the weight of their eyes trying to twist every word into ammunition. Some battles are won loudly, but the ones that last are won by preparing the field so completely that when the final move is made, no one has the strength left to fight. The night before I finally opened my father's sealed letter, I sat alone in my apartment with the envelope on the table as if it were a witness I had been avoiding, and the longer I stared at the heavy paper with its stubborn seal, the more I felt the weight of weeks of conflict pressing down, each argument and maneuver stacking like bricks in a wall I could not move without uncovering the truth my father had deliberately delayed. I had resisted reading it in front of the others because I knew their voices would twist every syllable into ammunition, but even in solitude I hesitated, almost afraid that his words would either end the fight in one clean strike or cut me down in ways my family had never managed to do on their own. Eventually, with the kind of deep breath I usually reserve for signing contracts or ending relationships, I broke the seal and unfolded the letter that had traveled from his hand into mine through the careful machinery of law. His handwriting was steadier than I expected for a man who had written it weeks before surgery, a neat block script that carried no visible tremor. And his words began without sentiment or apology, but with the blunt clarity of someone who had lived long enough to despise wasted air. He wrote that the house was never meant to be a prize or a burden, that walls and floors should shelter rather than divide, and that his fear was not of death but of leaving behind a family who would transform a home into a battlefield. So he had placed the responsibility on the one child he believed could endure resentment without breaking. He admitted that the choice would look unfair, that my mother would call it favoritism, and that my brother would call it betrayal. But he insisted that trust must rest with the one who understood that legacy is not measured in speeches about sacrifice, but in whether the roof stays dry and the foundation holds. Then, near the middle, his words shifted from the practical to something heavier, a line that caught in my throat as I read it. The house must remain a house because once a family allows it to become a weapon, the family itself no longer exists, and you, my daughter, are the only one who has ever understood that survival is not the same as performance. He reminded me of the nights he let me sit beside him at the kitchen table while he balanced the checkbook, the way I noticed every missing dime when Evan laughed and waved it away, and the way I asked questions that were not polite but necessary. He told me to expect hatred dressed as righteousness, tears dressed as strategy, and silence dressed as compliance, and he said, almost cruelly, that my burden was to carry through with decisions that would feel cold but would, in time, prove warmer than empty promises. The letter ended not with instruction but with a challenge, asking whether I could resist the temptation to punish and instead find a way to keep the house alive without surrendering it to the same cycles of indulgence and neglect that had scarred it in recent years. He admitted that, even from the grave, he could not dictate every detail, that law could carry the framework but not the spirit, and that ultimately my choices would reveal whether his faith had been misplaced or not. I folded the paper carefully, slid it back into its envelope, and sat in the kind of silence that has shape and gravity, realizing that the document had not ended the conflict but transformed it into something more dangerous. The weight of choice that could not be shifted to anyone else. The next evening I called the family together, not at Mom's house with its staged sanctimony, but at the property itself, where the air smelled faintly of dust and wood polish, and where the echoes made it impossible to forget how empty a house becomes when voices fill it only with arguments. They arrived wary and impatient, Evan pacing as though prepared for another battle, Mom already armed with new rhetoric about unity, and Kara silent but watchful, carrying the children's distraction in her eyes. I held the letter in my hand but did not read it aloud. Instead, I summarized its contents in the calm tone of someone presenting a case, telling them that Dad's explicit wish was that the house remain a house, not a bargaining chip, not a stage for votes, not a prize to be awarded in the court of guilt. Evan erupted, accusing me of twisting words, of using ambiguity as leverage, and Mom followed with her insistence that Dad's intent was clear if only I were willing to honor it. But I stood firm and laid out the only option that fulfilled both law and morality as Dad had defined it. The property would not pass to Evan, nor would it be sold to strangers. But it would be placed into a trust arrangement that reserved its long-term benefit for the next generation, specifically for Evan's eldest daughter, who would inherit access when she came of age, with the trust ensuring the house was maintained and leased responsibly until then. For a long moment the room was pure disbelief, Evan choking out protests that I had skipped him entirely, Mom gasping that I had no right to alter Dad's structure, but I simply pointed to the trustee clause and the authority it carried, reminding them that Dad had not given me this role to win arguments, but to protect the house from exactly this performance. Their outrage was sharp but strangely hollow, because even as Evan shouted about betrayal and Mom muttered about cruelty, there was an undeniable finality in the fact that I had made a decision that honored Dad's words without catering to their staged morality. And the silence that followed my announcement carried the weight of realization that there was nothing left to vote on, nothing left to manipulate. I collected my things, left them standing in the echo of a house that no longer answered to their claims, and stepped out into the night with the cool air washing over me, the keys heavy in my pocket and the letter heavier still in my bag. As I walked to my car, I felt neither victory nor peace, but something more complicated, an uneasy recognition that revenge had not come in the form of locking them out or shaming them in front of each other, but in creating a structure where their games could not reach, where the next generation would have the chance to claim a home untainted by the noise of this battle. Whether they would ever forgive me or whether I would ever forgive myself remained unanswered, and perhaps that was the point my father had been making all along, that some legacies are not about comfort or applause, but about standing still while the storm howls, ensuring that when it passes, the house is still standing.